I really think Richard Ford came tonight because I was born in Mississippi, and he's a Mississippian, and he knew I was getting very, very nostalgic about Eudora Welty and Mr. Shelby Foote, who always called me Miss Peggy, and I loved it because he had such a nice accent. And Richard Ford doesn't have an accent, but I'm slowly teaching him to come back. We're just so delighted to have all of you. Do you know he is crowning our 33rd year. Isn't that wonderful? Thank you, Richard, so much.
Good evening. My name is Kimberly Johnson. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the Tulsa City County Library System. And I want to thank you for joining us this evening for the 2017 Peggy V. Helmerich Distinguished Author Dinner. As Mrs. Helmerich mentioned, for the past 3 decades, this event has brought the best and the brightest literary voices to Tulsa, and at the same time has showcased all Tulsa has to offer to our esteemed visitors. A year ago, we celebrate our first Distinguished Author Dinner right here in the newly renovated library, which was made possible by individuals, foundations, corporations, the City of Tulsa, under the leadership of Capital Campaign Chair Robert J. LaFortune. Since then, we have enjoyed increased customer visits and circulation of materials, and many lives have been changed through the use of this 21st century facility. This year, library customer Lorna Doyle fulfilled a lifelong dream to host her own talk show called Tulsa Talks, using our state-of-the-art audio lab. Local fashion designer instructor Michelle Mawego created a one-of-a-kind runway fashion piece using the 3D printer and laser cutter found right here at our makerspace. And then Deborah Worthington used our research services and robust databases to plan and open her own business. H2 Oasis Float Center is now located in the Farm Shopping Center. So these are just a few of the many inspirational stories that would not have been possible just 1 year ago, but are now being realized in our community. We're truly blessed by our generous friends who saw the potential that this library could bring to downtown Tulsa. And we're so proud to bring that vision to life for our city and our entire county. Before I take my seat, I do want to thank this year's event chair and her committee, who have worked tirelessly for months to make tonight a very special literary evening for you to enjoy and to remember. So I want to ask Laura Stafer to come up. For her hard work and her creativity, we have a little something to give you. Okay. Thank you. I love flowers. And I cannot take my seat without also thanking the visionary behind the celebrated Distinguished Author Series, Mrs. Peggy Helmerich. This event is a true testament of your longstanding devotion for our library and our community. We are grateful to have the privilege of honoring the best contemporary authors like tonight's recipient. We appreciate you and your family's generosity. Thank you again. And now I would like to welcome Adrian Alexander, the chair of the Author Selection Committee, to the podium to introduce this year's award winner. Adrian?
So I was going to tell you first that the first thing you need to know about Richard Ford, he's from Mississippi, but Peggy beat me to it. So he is from Jackson, Mississippi. Born there in 1944. He still calls it home because that's where he was born. And he grew up in the same neighborhood as another recipient of this award, Miss Eudora Welty. and attended the same high school as she. But he would not meet her until 1981, when he was teaching at Princeton for a year and was by then the author of a published novel. And he thought Miss Eudora probably knew that. And he recalled in a 1996 interview in the Paris Review that he introduced himself to her by saying, "Miss Welty, I'm Richard Ford and I'm from Jackson, Mississippi." And she replied, "Oh, are you?" His immediate reaction was that she probably hated his book, since it was full of dirty words, sex, and violence. Skip forward to 1986, after the publication of his novel, The Sports Writer, and Ford is doing a book signing in his hometown, and he's dutifully signing copies, and then happens to look up, and there stands Miss Eudora. And she looks him in the eye and says, "Well, I thought I should come and pay my regards." And that reunion in Jackson began a friendship that would last until her death in 2001. Richard was a pallbearer at her funeral and remains her literary executor. Richard's parents were both from Arkansas, although I believe his father, Parker, was second-generation Irish. Is that correct, Richard? From County Cavan near Ulster, by the way. Richard was only 8 when his father suffered a severe heart attack, and thereafter he spent as much of his time with his grandparents in Little Rock, living in the hotel they managed, as he did at home in Jackson. His father would succumb to a second heart attack in 1960 when Richard was only 16. Living in a hotel had an influence on his choice of colleges. He enrolled at Michigan State University to study hotel administration because, as he said, it was the only thing he knew much about at the time. But while working one summer on the Missouri Pacific Railroad as a locomotive fireman, he began his first serious reading as a young man. Mild dyslexia had been a challenge. And he started with William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom. Might as well go for the heavy stuff right away, or skip all that other James Bond and that kind of stuff. It was an experience that would change his major at college as well as his life, quite literally. He graduated from MSU in 1966 with a BA in English, spent a year in law school, and doing a couple of other things along the way before he entered the creative writing program at the University of California, Irvine. He received his MFA there in 1970, learning his new craft under the likes of E.L. Doctorow, another recipient of ours, and Oakley Hall. Along the way, he married the love of his life, Christina, who is here with us tonight as well. A 3-year grant from the Michigan Society of Fellows enabled Ford to begin his career as a writer while also teaching creative writing at a number of colleges in the years to come, including Princeton and Columbia, where actually he and Christina are both on faculty now. Early on, however, Christina had wisely advised him to turn down an offer of a tenure-track teaching position at Michigan. "Don't take that job," Richard recalls her saying. "You'll look around and you'll be 45 years old and you'll still be here." Instead, the Fords have lived in a wide variety of locales over the decades since, from New Orleans to Maine and from New York City to Montana. The result for Richard has been an incredible body of work as a fiction writer of short stories and novels, with major awards in 3 consecutive decades of work. After publishing 2 novels and a number of stories in the 70s and 80s, the novel that is generally considered to be Ford's breakthrough book, The Sports Writer, was published in 1986, and it introduced us to a character for whom Richard Ford is best known, Frank Bascom. When we first meet him, Frank is a failed novelist turned sports writer, living in New York and New Jersey, who is still mourning the loss of a young son 4 years before, as well as the subsequent failure of his marriage. Let me take a minute just to tell you a little bit about the 4 Bascom books. New York Times book critic Michiko Kakutani, writing on Ford's work 20 years later, said that Frank Bascom is not only a literary cousin to Rabbit Angstrom of John Updike's acclaimed Rabbit novels, but also a spiritual descendant of Bix Balling, the self-conscious hero of Walker Percy's Moviegoer. Sunk deep in the effluvia of day-to-day routines, she adds, he broods over the big existential questions of the human condition, seeking to maintain a supportable existence that resembles actual life, while trying to manage his expectations and dreams. The Sports Writer was named to Time Magazine's 5 Best Books list of 1986 and was a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction. It would be almost a decade later, however, before readers would reunite with Frank Bascom in the novel Independence Day in 1995. The story revolves around Frank's plan to reunite with and reconnect with his troubled son Paul over the holiday weekend by way of a road trip to the basketball and baseball halls of fame. Frank is a successful realtor now, while his ex-wife is remarried and lives in Connecticut with their 2 remaining kids. If things go well, Anne, his ex-wife, will agree to let Paul go back to New Jersey and live with Frank. But of course, things don't go as well as Frank had hoped, and almost end disastrously, in fact. The book is an amazing combination of what Barbara Ehrenreich described as dead-on dialogue and a perfect rendering of small-town and suburban distractedness, plus brilliant character sketches that covering a wide range of assorted people in Frank's life. Independence Day would become the first book to win both the Pulitzer Prize in 1995 for fiction and the PEN/Faulkner Award for fiction in the same year. Only one other book published since has done the same. The Lay of the Land, published in 2006, finds Frank living on the Jersey Shore with a new wife, sort of. His 2 grown children have somewhat unique lives of their own now, though neither live nearby. His Thanksgiving weekend with his family, with the still undecided Bush-Gore election as a backdrop, turns out to be more of an adventure than I think any reader of Frank Bascom could have imagined at the beginning of the book. Merle Rubin in the Christian Science Monitor wrote that it bristles with energy, with a natural assurance on the part of the writer. The 4th installment of the Frank Bascom story appeared just a couple of years ago in 2015, and this book was a finalist for that same prestigious award, the Pulitzer, 2 decades after winning the prize in 1995. Titled Let Me Be Frank with You. Get it? The book is not a novel. Instead, it consists of a series of 4 interconnected novellas, or as Richard prefers to call them, long stories. Frank narrates each story in its turn, and they all connect to him, though 2 turn out to be total surprises. Maureen Corrigan of NPR, along with other reviewers, loved this book, and so did I, quite frankly. In some ways, it's a perfect ending to the Bascom saga. But is it the end, in fact? There's not time tonight for me to talk about all of Richard's body of work as a fiction writer, although I'd really love to. But let me quickly touch on a couple of other important books. His first collection of short stories, by the way, Rock Springs, was published in 1986 and is sensational. His characters are very different people than we encounter in the Bascom books, and the book offers a powerful writing style and language that are very different too. Rock Springs was a major reason why he won the 1995 Ray Award for the short story and the 2001 PEN/Malamud Award for excellence in short fiction. The last book I want to mention here is my other personal favorite of Richard's. Published in 2012, Canada is a return of sorts to that same gritty, dirty realism style and setting that we first saw in those early stories and in his intriguing 1990 novel, Wildlife. Reviewing Canada for the New York Times, novelist Andre Dubus III said it best. Canada is blessed with 2 essential strengths in equal measure. A mesmerizing story driven by authentic and fully realized characters, and a prose style so accomplished it is tempting to read each sentence 2 or 3 times before being pulled to the next. I can't think of a better description of Richard Ford's work, so let me just end by saying, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce to you the 2017 recipient of the Peggy V. Helmerich Distinguished Author Award, Mr. Richard Ford.
Thank you, Adrian. This tuxedo thing here, I've never felt less like a Democrat in my life. The Fords don't travel light or easy, so I really have to thank Laura and Bert for being such pals to us and being our hosts for the last 24 hours. And also Zoe Innett, who put up with me, and Jackie Hill, who put up with me, and the wonderful Kimberly Johnson, whose house we're in. And thank you all very much for coming and for inviting Christina and me to come to Tulsa. We are thrilled to be here. And of course, we are shudderingly grateful to Mrs. Helmerich for her generosity to us and for and also for her and your faith in this library and its crucial missions. I'm a child of the public library in Jackson, Mississippi, what's now the Eudora Welty Library. My mother, when I was old enough to be left alone in a much more innocent time, which is to say age 8, my mother used to dump me in the library so she could have some relief from looking after me. I was not an easy child. I did not understand supervision. The librarians, though, you know, those old-timey librarians, they could deal with me. That sort of outsourced parenting is familiar, I'm sure, in Tulsa today. I was, as Adrian said, am mildly dyslexic, and in the library, I may only have managed to work out that a book was a thing, and that books were treated as precious things by adults, and that books needed to be preserved, not from me, but for me. I doubt I actually ever read one. Today, though, I have 5 library cards in 5 different towns, all of them current, which probably isn't kosher. Don't tell Kimberly about that. I do readings and talks in libraries all over everywhere, from the LA Public to the Philadelphia Free Library, from the Carnegie Library in Clarksdale, Mississippi, to the Skedumfer Library in Damariscotta, Maine, where we live. That's my give back to do that. I see what librarians are doing, not just showing the dismal likes of me what a book is, but binding diverse communities intimately together. I see the dedication of librarians' lives to their vocation, to all the stuff that they didn't learn in library science. I see what libraries are worth to citizens and our citizenship, and I thank you. A few years ago, I was sitting at a computer in the Great Falls Public Library in Montana. It was not unusual for me to be there. Computer access is offered free to library members and also free to non-library members. I was actually working on my novel, Canada, in the library. The machines there get a lot of use by people who otherwise don't have computer access, so they can apply for jobs, or write to loved ones, or contact their attorneys, or look up symptoms of diseases they're terrified they're suffering but have no other source of information about. All things we privileged folks take for granted. The library provides that. I was sitting next to a native kid, a boy who at a certain moment and completely unreluctantly leaned over to me and whispered, "Hey bro, can you spell?" At that time, I still could. I said, yes. He said, I'm writing a birthday email to my mother over in Spokane. Does heart have an A in the middle of it? I don't want to misspell it, he said. I was able to assure him that heart has an A in the middle of it. We were there together in the library. When I started thinking about this talk for now, this evening, which is titled Some Thoughts About Memoir, it was more than a year ago, and it was intended to be a relief from politics. You'll remember the election of last year. Today, though, to speak about memory seems much more of a political cautionary, one that's conceivably pertinent to our very survival. It's through our memory, after all, as my friend Joan Didion writes, that we retain, and I'll quote her, a nodding acquaintance with who we once actually were and how life actually was, whether we like it or not. It's when we don't accurately engage the past, or when we forget the past, or when we lie about it, that we imperil ourselves and devalue our own experience. St. Augustine says our memory is a faculty of our soul, and it's when we neglect the past that truthless, soulless demagoguery can start to seem reasonable, and we become unable to distinguish what did happen from what did not happen. This distinction, noting what did happen and what did not, is one of civilization's starting points, and it is one of our citizenship's essential responsibilities. So, for instance, it's easy when we want to make America great again to forget that the Jackson, Mississippi Public Library in 1952 was all white. Now don't get nervous. It's not going to be one of those. I'm not going to go on and on about our president. You either know him or you don't by now. But I do want to take an opportunity to remind you of a remark by the English novelist George Eliot. The remark turns up in her introduction to her novel called Roderick Hudson. There she wrote, and I'll quote her, "There is no private life that has not been prefigured by a wider public life. There is no private life that has not been prefigured by a wider public life." As tired as we've all become of politics, all of our lives, even the lives of my Arkansas parents who seem to know or care as little as humanly possible about politics, all our lives at all times have a crucial political dimension. It's ingrained in our being a citizen, and it relies on our ability to distinguish what did happen from what did not. But let's try to talk about memoir in the unfreighted ways I imagined long ago, 2016. A year ago right now, I was waiting for the publication of my little memoir, which you have on your tables, about my parents, which is called Between Them. And I was getting ready to teach a graduate course on memoir at Columbia, where I'm a professor. And what I was noticing in my reading was that memoirs, how people wrote them, what their motives were for writing them, even the terms for talking about them, memoirs don't submit to any rules except an individual writer's private conception. In that one way, memoirs are like novels, except that a memoir and a novel arrive at their truths differently. One arrives at truth by reliance on facts. A novel arrives at truth by reliance on imagination and artifice. Somerset Maugham said once that there are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are. There are at least as few rules for writing a memoir. I'm going to give you an informal rule of thumb for how novels and memoirs are different kinds of creatures. Think of this, what writers do every day. We sit at a desk and we try to write sentences, and we come up with a hole in our sentence for which we do not have the right word. This happens to everybody. It happens to you, it happens to me. It's my job. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking at the ceiling and I'm looking at the thesaurus and I'm looking in the dictionary and I'm looking out the window and I'm writing a novel. And what I think is, gee, the word I'm looking for isn't really the word I'm looking for. I'm looking for a word that has 3 syllables, that has a long A in the middle, and maybe has a fricative someplace toward the end, and maybe a schwa-e early on. And I come up with a word which has just the right number of syllables and the right schwa-e in the right place, and I pop it into the sentence, and I think, ooh, look at that. The sentence means nothing like what I thought it was going to mean, but it suddenly seems to be something good, and I go with it. Northrop Frye said in fiction, you rely on a disinterested use of words. You must have nothing riding on the outcome. But when I'm writing a memoir and I get to that hole in my sentence, and I'm looking at the ceiling and I'm looking at the thesaurus and I'm looking for the word that I have to choose, I can't just choose any word because I'm writing about my mother. And it has to be true about my mother. It can't be just something that I attribute to my mother, because that's a different kind of piece of writing. A memoir has to be factual. It has to be true through the agency of facts. whereas a piece of fiction can be true through the agency of accident. It can be true through the agency of whimsy. It can be true because you get the right schwa-e sound and 4 syllables instead of 2. But when I'm writing about my mother, I've got to have the right word. And that's the difference between a memoir and a novel. Now, I clearly can write a memoir, but I think of myself mostly as a novelist. I've been a novelist for 50 years. I remember how long, because it's as long as Christina and I have been married, as of this next March. Only when strangers ask me on airplanes what I do for a living, I never admit it. I tell people that I am a retired FBI agent. It is just simply so much easier for their imagination to deal with that. When you tell strangers that you're a novelist, it just demoralizes them. They never know anything I've written. They don't know what I do on any given day. They don't know where my ideas come from. If I was Stephen King or John Grisham, it might be a little different. Usually, though, the conversation just comes to a stop. Unless they want to tell me about something, of course, which they have written. Everybody has written something, apparently, and I listen. But for me, it's better if I work for the FBI. It's so much more freeing than the burden of the truth. Remember St. Augustine saying that memory is a faculty of my soul. What he meant was that truth, any truth, is profound and not in any way simple. To tell the truth about someone's life, even your own life, relying solely on facts, is a very complicated business. Samuel Johnson wrote that everybody knows what light is, but it's hard to tell what light is. Telling a life is like telling what light is. Think about it. And not the least of life's complications is that most people's lives are dull and long and not very significant in any way. Even an FBI agent's life is like that. If we write a memoir, we have to have strong intuition about what's interesting and important in life, which is why we want to write it. But factually, to tell what makes a person interesting and significant in a way that is itself interesting and significant requires immense ingenuity and imagination and empathy, which is to say it requires a willingness to see, among other things, what's obvious, and at the same time to suppose that the conventional wisdom about what's obvious is probably wrong. I call this kind of thinking, and we'll talk about it tomorrow morning, I call this kind of thinking oppositional thinking. It means realizing that your most fundamental assumptions about the world might not be true. And to tell a writer's life, if that's what I was going to try to explain to someone next to me on an airplane, a writer's life is so much duller than almost any life you can imagine. A writer's so much more ordinary. And yet, and here's the complicated oppositional part, out of that dull life can arise hugely important things in the right hands, the very important things that would make us want to know about that person to begin with. A memoir, a good memoir, would try to reconcile this discrepancy, the discrepancy which says, quote, the experience I went through wasn't nearly as compelling as the one I write about. It's certainly the challenge I undertook in writing about my wonderful parents. Now for clarity, I'm a professor, okay. Now for clarity's sake, let's define what I'm talking about here. That is a written memoir. I stole this description from one of my colleagues whose name is Vivian Gornick from her very useful book called The Situation and the Story. Vivian writes that a memoir, and I quote her here, a memoir is a work of sustained narrative prose controlled by an idea of the self under obligation to lift from the raw material of life a tale that will shape experience and transform event and deliver wisdom. A memoir is a work of sustained narrative prose controlled by an idea of the self under obligation to lift from the raw material of life a tale that will shape experience, transform event, deliver wisdom. Oh my God, it's a mouthful. But think about that the next time somebody sitting next to you on an airplane asks you what you do for a living. Or when you ask someone what he or she does, think about truth's obligation to create a tale that shapes experience, that transforms event, and delivers wisdom. Better to just say you're an FBI agent and let the whole damn thing go. A memoir need not be about oneself. A memoir can be about your parents, like mine. Or it can be about your wife or your husband, as Julian Barnes and Joan Didion wrote. Memoirs, as I said, are all different. Not even 3 rules apply. Some memoirs are about place, like North Toward Home by Willie Morris. Some are about a period of time, like Diane McWhirter's wonderful book about Birmingham called Carry Me Home. Some are informal, like Eudora's One Writer's Beginnings, which you got to read. Some are scholarly, some are essayistic, some are comedic, some are stern, some are sad, like Jessamine Ward's wonderful, troubling memoir, When We Reaped. A memoir requires a subject that's personal to you and that comes out of your direct factual experience about which you feel a commotion in your mind that virtually demands that this be written about. And a memoir simply shouldn't be fiction. It shouldn't be a disinterested use of language. It should be an interested use of language because, again, you've got something riding on the outcome. I've got my mother. When something is advanced to us as fact, we who are hearing it or reading it, we rely on it differently from how we rely on fiction. In fiction, truth is always provisional and open to debate. Fact, on the other hand, relies on our profound faith that events do happen, which is why corrupting our confidence about what did or did not happen is such a civic menace. A memoir is also different from an autobiography. A memoir usually addresses only a part of a life or only one view of a longer life. An autobiography spans an entire life. I know these definitions are old hat to you, but I don't know how you feel about memoirs. You might think a memoir is just therapy for the writer and of little use to the reader, or that a memoir is always inferior to the novel, namely an art form for writers who have only their own lives to tell about. Tolstoy dismissed Turgenev's memoir as being, as he said, pointing to a tear in the writer's eye. Plus, there are all these untruthful memoirs we all know about, James Fry's terrible book, that are simply meant to deceive us. A novel may be superior. A novel at least announces itself as made up rather than relying on the unstable amalgam of the personal, remembered, and the strictly factual. Facts are tough. We all know that. They don't give. When readers read my books and report to me on how they feel about them, and it is not always welcome, it's mostly okay. People are nice. People rarely stop me on the street and say nasty things to me. But when they do, I almost always learn something. I don't write books for myself. I only write books so somebody will read them. To me, writing is not a form of self-expression. I can express myself adequately without writing it down. It's something I do for others. As Sartre says, writing has to escape its maker to become its full, beautiful self. Escaping its maker means writing has to get read and enter the reader's unpredictable experience for it to be fully finished. When I wrote Between Them, this memoir about my parents, what surprised me was that so many readers told me that my book made them think about their own parents and in ways they hadn't thought about them before. In many instances, they said, they were at that point sitting down right then to write a memoir of their parents, and thank you very much. But even after I wrote these 2 memoirs, I was clinging still to my original, rather Spartan intention that by writing my book, I was merely pointing the world toward my wonderful but otherwise unnoticeable parents, because I thought the conventional wisdom about what was worthy of the world's attention was simply too limited. And then in writing about these 2 people, my folks, I could pronounce it to be a virtue, that they were merely what and who they were. I thought, at least at the beginning, that a reader would come away from reading about my parents knowing and feeling nothing more than what I had said about them, and that my parents wouldn't remind anybody of anybody, which is, of course, crazy for the reasons that Sartre says writing has to escape its maker. Readers, these fond, unknowable people, readers simply understand what they understand. Though I should say that to think the way I did is perfectly consistent with my overall wish to control everything. And for the reader to think only what I want him to think and not what I don't want her to think. This is what it means to be an author. I authorize everything. When I got out of college, one of the things that Adrian didn't mention, my first job application was to be an Arkansas State Trooper. It isn't that different from being a writer. My readers, though, sitting down to write their memoirs made me wonder, is everybody destined to write a memoir at some time or other in their lives? In this era of selfies and tweets and blogs and taking pictures of what I'm having for lunch, are ourselves and our personal responses all we're ever going to be interested in? Can we not get away from ourselves? Is our only voice, is our own voice our only instrument with which to speak into what Emerson called the infinite remoteness that underlies us all? Is the last sound any of us will ever hear out in the cold intergalactic void going to be me, 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 more me, less you? Is memoir our inevitable default form of utterance? I don't think so. Memoirs didn't even come along as a public form until Rousseau's Confessions in the second half of the 18th century. The ancient Greeks knew little or nothing about memoirs. Xenophon, whoever Xenophon was. Xenophon wrote something called Memorabilia, which was supposedly about his personal experience with Socrates, but this turns out to be completely made up, kind of Greek novel. Saying that something's factually true can be just a strategy to create plausibility, as we all know, and as we see in our president. It may feel natural for us to want to tell what happened to us and how it was important and what it meant. But as Philip Larkin says, we regularly confuse what's natural with what's morally good. And preserving the distinction between what feels natural and what is actually morally good should make writing a memoir a great deal more difficult and less inviting, far less than inevitable. Remember the complaints I mentioned against memoir's stability as an art form. So, if it's unstable and not at all inevitable, why does a person write a memoir? And what are the sources of any memoir's goodness and wisdom? How does a memoir, like Vivian Gornick says, transform and shape experience? Maybe if we know one memoir, how it works, maybe we can know why it works. Best then to speak personally for a few minutes about my parents. I won't say anything more important to you this evening than that I was moved to write a memoir about my mother and father because I missed them. There are two separate remembrances in this little book. I wrote about my mother in 1986, 5 years after she died. I wrote about my father and put these two memoirs together into one volume in 2015, 55 years after he died, and long after anyone might think I'd have stopped missing my parents and simply conceded their absence and gone on with life. But this sensation of missing my parents, whether it was usual or conventional or not, was strong in me. One of the human features that makes me or anybody be a writer is that I pay attention to these strong, wordless feelings in myself. I don't ignore or devalue them. It can make me a pain in the ass, a hothouse flower for sure. But if I can understand these internal commotions in myself, and I do, to be a call to language as an urge to write, sometimes things can turn out okay. Plus, in choosing to write about my parents, rather than just remembering them, I understood I was using memoir not only because I missed them and wanted to draw them close to me again, but also to try to defeat some of death's great tidal forces. One, the force that creates emotional and physical distance and leads us to forget. And two, the force that blurs the past and clouds lives with inaccuracies, and that slowly we become conventional creatures, permanent misunderstanders. Our memory, this precious faculty of our soul, can dissolve in time into what the philosopher Martin Buber calls the urge to see man as a unity, which is to say, as a generality rather than as the individual she or he has always been, and as we have known him. And I also wanted to think about more than my parents' deaths, which were so vivid and were the last of their lives that I ever witnessed, and to think instead about their lives. Contemplation of anyone's death, it began to seem to me, should lead us to contemplate the life that's ended. In other words, I wanted to widen the lens and sharpen the focus because that seemed more commensurate with my experience of my parents, more accurate, which would be a way to deliver wisdom, I thought. And if these are not compelling reasons to write a memoir, then I don't know any. And they have something to do with why anybody writes a memoir: to defeat forgetfulness, to rescue truth from conventional thinking, to separate what did happen from what did not. Because I'm a novelist and I'm used to making lives up, someone might say that I could have written about my parents' lives as a novel rather than as a memoir. In the first place, though, this sort of fundamental decision is almost always made before you ever actually think about it, so that you don't think about it at all. You just follow your instinct. And in the case of my mother, her life was small, barely noticeable in the world's eye. Possibly she would have been a difficult subject for a novel. My father, even more so. The apparatus and artifice of a novel might have overpowered them both and made them seem what they weren't, just to make them seem plausible as characters. But they were real. They didn't need to be made plausible. They weren't characters. They'd happened. What I wanted was a way of writing that could be as closely, as I said, commensurate with their lives as possible. No artifice. I wanted only the facts of their lives to become clear and true. And there was one more thing that urged me to memoir. Henry James wrote that if we were never bewildered, there would be no stories to tell about us. If we were not bewildered, there would be no stories to tell about us. What James meant when he said that, wrote that, was that good writing is often powered, as you know, by unresolved contradictions in our lives, acknowledged or unacknowledged, but contradictions that affect us strongly. The strength of what we write is often achieved by our writing success in engaging the torque of these contradictions and by harmonizing them inside the writing. The process is part of a process we call composition. When Seamus Heaney wrote in his poem Harvest Bow that, and I'll quote him, "The end of art is peace," end quote, this is what he meant. He wasn't talking about peace with Northern Ireland. He was talking about writing, managing to harmonize the bewildering forces that inspire the writing. In my relations with both my parents before their deaths and after, there were things that just didn't fit together for me and that made for complications, not big problems, just complexities. I'm not sure I could have told you what these were before I started writing. I just knew something was motivating me to write about them. This is the commotion that I mentioned before, something you feel in your chest. There were more than one of these, of course. There always are one of these commotions that we feel about our parents. The one I'll mention will probably disappoint you. You may not even think it rises to the level of genuine bewilderment, but again, I noticed these things. I am the pain in the ass who does this. I became aware after my mother died that although she'd been, for all appearances, a regular human being, not accomplished, not successful in a worldly way, she had nonetheless created an almost paradoxically large and lasting effect on me. I thought that my mother's and my complex affection and our outsized relationship were exceptional, but we were not. facts which didn't easily go together in my mind. Any son's enlarged estimation of his mother could just be thought of as commonplace, but it seemed to me that if I closely noticed it and particularized it in sentences that I would write, rather than just passing it off as commonplace, I might possibly identify the unexpected human virtue I mentioned before. And not just in my mother, and not just in myself, and not just in all mothers and sons relations, but in all of human relations whereby we turn to notice someone else. This chance to identify a virtue where something less than a virtue has been thought to reside is another good reason to write a memoir and a source of precious wisdom. I didn't know this when I started, and I wasn't really aware of it even when I'd written it through once and could think about it a lot. You could say I snuck up on my large writerly ambitions after believing I had only modest writerly ambitions to start with. Our ambitions, I suppose, can catch us unawares. Okay, enough about me and my memoir. You get the idea. I said this talk was going to be some thoughts about memoir, not every single word about it. I'll turn us toward the end now. Earlier, I was wondering whether we're all destined to write a memoir. Probably we're not. Most of you will be perfectly happy just writing your novels. But a complaint I hear a lot voiced about memoirs and their authors is that when yet another 19-year-old who's lived in Riverview all of her life, has never apparently experienced a cloudy day, has been loved and doted on and showered with expensive durable goods all of her life, when that young person steps into the spotlight to publish his or her memoir, which is almost always entitled Growing Up Weird, the usual complaint is, what's she got to write about? He hasn't lived long enough to have any memories worth telling. He doesn't know enough about the world to tell me anything important. He lacks wisdom. It is a natural readerly skepticism. My personal rule when someone sets out to write something others are supposed to read is that the writer must have asked the crucial question of himself or herself, do I have anything to tell? And can I tell it well enough that somebody else will take their precious time to read it and will benefit from knowing it? Is it only interesting because it happened to me? Me. In my own case, the question was, are my parents' lives important just because they're my parents? B.S. Pritchett has a wonderful remark about that. If you want to read a really great and exemplary memoir, read Pritchett's memoir called A Cab at the Door, which is a paragon of the form and which answers this very question. Pritchett said once about writing memoirs, it's all in the art. You don't get credit for just living. So no, it's not interesting just because it happened to me or because they were my parents. We don't get credit for just being who we are. Literature is important business, memoirs included. We need to believe we have something important for the reader, and we need to be able to say no if we don't. The English critic F.R. Leavis wrote, quote, literature is the supreme means by which we undergo a renewal of our sensuous and emotional life and learn a new awareness. Like I said at the beginning, to tell a life is a complicated undertaking. The requirements are considerable. You're making something for someone else where before there was nothing. And life is all we have. You know, I remember once a long time ago when I was in my mid-20s, and Christina and I were living in Ann Arbor, and I was attempting to write a first novel I ever wrote. I knew a man, a colleague at the University of Michigan, who, like me, was a young guy and from the South. I do, too, have an accent. He was married with children and was an in-the-closet gay man who had just had a scholarly book turned down and was in the process of losing his professor's job. He had, you could say, a lot going on, and all of it wasn't pretty. One day we were sitting having coffee. It was in the pretty autumn that they have in Michigan. It was 1972. This fellow was in that day a ferocious mood and had very little time or interest in the likes of me pottering away on my novel. At a certain moment, he put his coffee cup down, narrowed his eyes, stared at me with supreme contempt, and said, "You're writing a novel, aren't you, Richard?" "Yes," I said, smiling inanely, "I am." "All the great novelists," he said contemptuously, "have been hungry at some point in their lives. When have you ever been hungry?" I have thought about these words for the rest of my life. When he said them to me, they stung me like a nettle because I thought, never. I've never been hungry. I haven't suffered very much, and frankly, I hope I never suffer anymore. Clearly, therefore, I have no right to be writing a novel. I have nothing to tell the world that could renew its sensuous and emotional life and provide a new wisdom. I am a fraud. And yet somehow, 45 years later, here I am in Oklahoma, me and Leon Russell and Jim Thompson, all of us writers, my heroes. The novel I was writing that day in 1972 is still in print, and there are a dozen more books behind it. We can all wait till later to get into the sticky business of whether or not I am or ever was a fraud, and whether any of my books are worth anything, and whether or not I missed my calling by not becoming an Arkansas State Trooper. But again, you see my point. We should regularly all ask ourselves if we're a fraud, because the world will, and we should be willing to answer truly. But we should also realize that there are no age requirements, no qualifications observable from the outside, no uniform hungers one must experience in order to write something of value, something that takes strength from the torques and complications of ordinary life, in which the world will actually be better for knowing if we can just write it well enough. Who of us can say to another human being, "You are not capable of art and eloquence"? Nobody, and nobody should. My great friend Eudora wrote at the end of her own memoir, One Writer's Beginning, she said, quote, "You can see that I have lived a sheltered life, but a sheltered life can be daring. All true daring starts from within." It's because we, all of us tonight here, believe this, and because we believe that to know another's life truly is a great gift. And we're here today, whether we'll write a memoir or write a novel or write nothing at all, because we believe that. It's still knowledge that is precious to us to know that we look at others every day. We are better off for knowing it. Thank you.